One of the biggies of the history of the North Shore, it's the lighthouse system. Young people coming up who are learning about history, and also people moving into the area. The North Shore or North Side is a term that is north of the Lake Pontchartrain, and it includes 3 parishes. In a period of less than 50 years, 4 countries from 1760 to 1810 were owners of the land over there. They were the ones that the administrators. And I have one of in one of the books, I have listed the 4 countries. The first one would be the French colony, of course. That it started over there with Iberville and his brother, the Iberville boys, Iberville and Bienville, the Lemoyne boys, and their trip to the North Shore with the intention of starting a French colony. So the French period is from 1699 to 1763. The British period comes next from 1763 to 1783, 20 years. And then the Spanish from 1783 to 1810. And finally, after 1810, the American period, Confederate period, and so forth, until the present. So the North Shore is a land across the lake, a term, North Shore, North Side, that includes 3 parishes. The main parish is St. Tammany, that takes 80% of the lakefront. 20% is Tangipahoa going to the west, and then back of St. Tammany is Washington Parish. This is what we're talking about, the area that we're going to talk about. On the mouth of the Tchefuncte River is the Lighthouse, and it's very interesting. Up to now, it hasn't been done in detail. And the reason is, like I said, that 4 countries were the owners of the land over there over a period. And for people to do research on history there, the records are scattered all over, half a world away. The origin is a 2-fold origin where it starts from. One is the British colonies on the Atlantic Ocean side, especially Massachusetts. And the other one is, of course, the area of the Gulf Coast started by the Lemoyne brothers. And both of them start in the 1600s. They had a lighthouse and a beacon in Boston Harbor as early as 1673. What they had is what they call the beacon is an iron pot with tar and pitch on wood or something fire, and it was a small fire, but it helped the ships getting out of Boston Harbor. It was very inefficient, and its light did not shine that far out into the waters. The other origin is the Gulf Coast. The Lemoyne brothers come in 1699. They bring a stone with them. Later we're going to find out about one of the lighthouse keepers had this stone found and kept it. But anyway, they came in 1699 and to start a French colony. And their lighthouse system started, which is Mobile Bay. So the 2 main starting points was Boston Harbor and also Mobile Bay. Boston Harbor now they claim that they have the oldest lighthouse system in the United States, in North America. What they're claiming is that it was a stone tower they built, a circular stone tower, and that was considered the first. The French, when after they explored a little bit, they decided to settle in Mobile in 1702, up Mobile Bay to Mobile River, 27 miles up, and that would be their settlement, the first settlement. So this is the starting point. Into Mobile Bay, there was a big problem. There was two little channels going in there. One of them was almost useless, and the other one was in between two sandbars at the end of Dolphin Island. And it was the water was 15 feet deep between these two sandbars, but it was very narrow, and the large ships couldn't get in there, and that was a problem. After a few years of up there on the 27 miles up the Mobile River by an Indian village with a settlement, some of the men wanted to move down back to Mobile Bay. And in 1707, Parent, Rochon, Dordan, Lebeuf, and their families moved back to the bay on the east side. The problem was still getting in and out with large ships. They had to unload them. The large ships couldn't come in. In 1711, Bienville decided to move his establishment and headquarters down the river to Mobile Bay. So he ordered one of his crew members, Frenchman, was called Simon de la Pointe. And Simon de la Pointe and his brother came with Bienville and Iberville on their first trip in 1699. Both of their fathers, Simon de la Pointe and his brother, and the Lemoyne brothers' fathers were friends back in Canada, and they were in the fur trade. And this is why LaPointe had something else too. LaPointe was from La Rochelle, and he was interested in land and what was over there in the new French settlement, and to make a fortune or whatever. Anyway, he had a business back in Rochelle. It was called the light business. He made candles out of sperm whale. He made lanterns out of the liquid of sperm. This is where whaling became popular. This was the lighting that they used, and the French and British used it starting with lighthouses over there in Europe. They were ahead of us. But anyway, when Bienville decided to move his headquarters down to Mobile Bay, which is going to be the city of Mobile, he instructed Simon de la Pointe, one of the men that came with him who was in the light business, to establish a lighthouse on the end of entrance into the bay on Dolphin. He stayed on Dolphin Island. He didn't go up there to the river. Anyway, so over the years, I was interested in the French settlement and so forth, and I started to collect bits and pieces. It took over 45, 50 years of putting all these pieces together. But the thing that really helped and that the people didn't have years ago was, of course, the computer, copying machines, cell phones. So all this is at my disposal now. So I go to the computer and I call up Dolphin Island. And I got about 6 or 7 pages of it, but I want to show you one. A map was drawn of Dolphin Island and Bay. And guess what's on the map? It says lighthouses. They got 2 houses, one by the red arrow up to Lighthouse. And this was done by Simon de la Pointe. It was probably crude, it was probably lanterns, and also one of the pictures show a ship, a small ship with a lighthouse system at the top of the mast. So this is the beginning of the lighthouse system on the North Shore during the French period. So we have the origins of the lighthouse now in Boston, and we have it in Mobile Bay, those two things, and how it's going to get down to the defuncta, this is my story. Simon de la Pointe made trips back and forth to La Rochelle. And he married, he brought his wife over there, and from 17, we don't know the exact date he put the lighthouses in. It could be 1707 or it could be 1711. But it was certainly, this map was drawn, it was printed in Paris in 1718. For them to draw the map and put that in, it took several years. So it's possible that this lighthouse system with the boat, the picture of the boat with the lighthouse on the mast here, and it beat Boston Harbor for their stone circular warehouse. But anyway, Simon de la Pointe kept living on the end of the island, and he'd make trips back and forth. He got married. A hurricane comes in 1707. And it closes a little channel of 15 feet between the two sandbars going into the bay. Simon de la Pointe then leaves Dauphine Island and he goes to Pascagoula, where he sets up his home and extension there. He has a family, and income now enters a person by the name of Krebs, Hugo Krebs from Germany. He comes over in 1730, and he marries the daughter of Simon de la Pointe, and with La Pointe, Simon de la Pointe and Hugh Krebs, they build a house, a lighthouse on the Pascagoula River. It's considered the oldest lighthouse on the Gulf Coast of the North Shore. Now, Hugo marries the daughter of Simon de la Pointe, and he starts having children. They have a family, and then his wife dies before about 1749. He marries a second time to a Mary Anne Chauvin de la Juice. There are the ones, the Krebs, and one of the sons, Basil, will be the ones that go over to the Defuncta River later on. But anyway, Hugo Krebs and Simon de la Pointe build this building that is now, it's called the La Pointe Krebs House in Jackson County. It's a big attraction on the North Shore for tourists. In comes the 7-Year War. Britain and France go at it. Britain is successful in defeating France and Spanish in the 7-Year War. As part of their victory, the settlement, they get West Florida. It's called British West and East Florida. They divide it into two parts. Hugo Krebs, who was a planter, he grew cotton and everything. One of a botanist came through there named Romans, and he noticed that Krebs, Hugo, had a machine that would pick cotton, and it's still considered one of the earliest machines of cotton. And anyway, Hugo didn't like the British. He was Catholic, German, French, and he wanted out. So he left. He picked up about 1770, and he left, and he moved his family to New Orleans. And before that, on one of his trips to New Orleans, after his wife died, he married Mary Ann Chauvin de la Jus. So here he goes to New Orleans, and he gets out of Pascagoula because he didn't like the British. But the war comes along for a second time. The colonists, after Britain started to pass these intolerable acts, started the Declaration of Independence and everything, and the American Revolution started. Hugo dies in 1776, and he leaves his wife, Mary Ann Chauvin, and his kids in New Orleans. The war is over. The colonists, the rebels, and the French and the Spanish are victorious. The Spanish, for their part, get West Florida, and the British move out. Now, the settlers in New Orleans looked to the North Shore, and they saw what the British did as far as development, plantations, Pensacola, and Mobile, the new things coming in. So they wanted to get some of these. Most of the British pulled out. They couldn't sell. A lot of them couldn't sell their land or their plantations, which they developed, and so people from the north, from New Orleans, applied for land grants, especially on these abandoned plantations. The Bahams come into Tchefuncte River. Parents become the commandant. Mary Ann Chauvin, she held off, but in 1790, she decides to apply for a land grant on the Tchefuncte River. And where was this land grant? Was it up the river where the land was more higher? And no, she picked the mouth of the river on the east bank in 1790. People couldn't understand it. It was sand, low, but Mary Ann Chauvin knew about her husband and Simon de la Pointe and the lighthouses over in Mobile. And she figured that she was acquainted with this, and she figured that that's going to be, as it develops and more people, it's going to be valuable. A lighthouse will be so she takes that as a land grant, and they build a house. One of the researchers doing history on the North Shore has a picture. He sent me a picture. This is Hugo, the picture of Hugo Krebs. This is his son, the baptismal, born, I believe, in 1760. They play an important part in the lighthouse on the Tchefuncte River. Very important. Let's go back to the Atlantic coast. We said that the revolution started and it ended with the rebels being victorious. What does it have to do with the lighthouse system? Well, they formed a Congress. And on August the 7th, 1789, the 9th Act of Congress was passed. And it was the first Public Works Act. It provided for the transfer They now had 12 lighthouses on the Atlantic coast. And they provided for the transfer of the existing lighthouses of the individual states to the federal government. And they used the Department of Treasury as the department which will handle the lighthouses. This was the 9th Act of Congress, first Public Works Act, and it had an important part in the history of the lighthouse system, which will affect the coast of the Gulf Coast. They transferred to the Department of Treasury. Alexander Hamilton was the secretary at that time, but the lighthouse system under that act was transferred to the Department of Treasury. There was a man in the Department of Treasury that plays an important part in the lighthouse system. In 1800, he was a clerk in the State Department when they built Washington, D.C., and he went with them. His name was Stephen Pleasanton. And here's a picture of Stephen, and he's going to play an important part. Stephen Pleasanton is going to be a key person in the history, the origin of the Chifuncta River Lighthouse. Now, we have to tell you a little bit about Pleasanton. He was a clerk, first of all in the State Department, and then he got transferred to the Treasury Department. But anyway, while in the State Department, the War of 1812 started. And the British landed their troops on the shores, Atlantic of the States, around Washington, and they're going to attack Washington and burn it down. Stephen, who was a clerk in the State Department office, was told by the president to take care of the books and the papers as much as he can and get them to safety. Stephen goes out and gets these coarse linear sacks. He starts putting the books and papers together. On the way out, loading up the carts and everything, he notices the Constitution on the wall in the frame. He takes that down and puts it in the sack. So he's the one that saved the Constitution during the War of 1812. Later on, in 1817, President James Monroe, for his efforts, gives him a new job. He gives him the job of the 5th auditor of the Department of Treasury, which you have the picture of. And from 1817 until he retired in 1852, he was responsible for the lighthouse system. It went, when he started, his death, he died in 1855. But to give you some ideas of how important he was, when he started as the 5th auditor of the Treasury Department, which has control of the lighthouses, there was only, I think, 50 lighthouses in the nation. When he retired, there's over 340. So he was, in his 30 years as 5th auditor of the Treasury Department, he was responsible for establishing averaging of 10 lighthouses a year for his 30 years. So, and in the 1840s, he was the one who went to Congress, and when he would do these lighthouses, he would get the contracts. He couldn't do it by himself, and he didn't know too much about lighthouses, so he used the customs collectors from each of the states to find the land and do all the work, get the contractor to build the lighthouses and everything. During Pleasanton's reign as General Superintendent of Lights from 1820 to 1852, the age to navigation of this country increased from a rather modest 55 lighthouses and a few buoys to 325 lighthouses and light ships, and numerous other aids such as buoys, range lights, etc. The fifth auditor supplied the various lighthouses in his charge and even had them and by contract. Anyway, this is the man that's the key to the lighthouse system, which will include the Tchefuncte River Lighthouse. We have Pleasanton as the fifth auditor, and the Treasury Department, and the customs agents are the ones that are involved in developing lighthouses. Going back to the Gulf Coast now, we get back to Krebs, Hugo Krebs. His first wife was Marie Josephine Krebs, and she died. They had a bunch of kids, and then he marries Mary Ann Chauvin, yeah. Simon dies, and he's buried over there in Pascagoula. Now, he's the one that started the lighthouses over in Mobile Bay. Now, Mary Ann Chauvin, as I said before, was the wife of Hugo Krebs. Hugo didn't like the British. He left Pascagoula, and he went to New Orleans. He got out of British West Florida. He went to Spanish New Orleans. He dies in 1776, leaves a will, and he also has a bunch of children with Mary Ann Chauvin Krebs. Mary Ann Chauvin, by the way, is related. It's one of my names in my pedigree chart. Her brother was Pierre Chauvin. He married Martha Ciano up in the Illinois country. They had business down in New Orleans, and the mother and Mary Ann came down, and Mary's mother died in New Orleans, and that's where Hugo Krebs met her. So Mary Ann Chauvin now is a widow. Hugo dies in 1776, and she's left in New Orleans in a house with the children. The war's over. The rebels were victorious. A new nation's declared, and the Spanish, for their reward of helping them against British West Florida, they start issuing land grants on the abandoned property. Mary Ann Chauvin wants a land grant too, but lo and behold, she doesn't want high land or something up the Tchefuncte. She takes a grant at the mouth of the Tchefuncte River in 1790. Why? Because of her association with Simon de la Pointe over in and her father, and they knew that. Then her son, who was getting up in age now, 25, he applies for a land grant in 1795. And that's on the other side of the river, the West Bank, which will become the property where the lighthouse is built. So now we have the Krebs owning the land on both sides of the river. So all they're doing, and as it fills up, land grants start filling up on the Tchefuncte River, the land becomes more and more valuable. And Bayou St. John, New Orleans, they have sandbanks too, and they had problems too. But they appealed to the government, and the government started a little action. In 1808, they appropriated land to study the mouth of Bayou St. John and to establish a lighthouse there. In 1811, they built the lighthouse. And also they established, Governor Claiborne wanted faster transportation with Washington. He went to the Spanish and got permission to have a route through Spanish West Florida, ending up on the Tchefuncte River by a large oak, which they called Post Oak. And that became a post depot for his. Then they issued a contract to a man called William Collins, the brother of John Wharton Collins, who started Covington. He was an ex-captain in the Navy and was between England and New Orleans, and he got the contract. He started running the mail routes, a boat, a fast mail packet between Bayou St. John and the Tchefuncte River. Trouble is, the Tchefuncte River was dangerous too. The Tchefuncte River had sandbars too. Marianne Chauvin has the east bank, and Basil gets the west bank, 31 acres over there. David Bannister Morgan does the surveying. Getting back to Bayou St. John, William Collins, gets a mail packet, and he's got to run that mail. He's got a contract to get the mail through. So he contacts, and this is my, there's no records on this, but we do know that there was some kind of a lighthouse system under Basil Krebs from 1811 on, when William Collins was running the mail packet there. And it was probably crude. The Coast Guard records have instances where they state that there was a lighthouse there in the 1820s and so forth. So it is my opinion that Basil Krebs had a lighthouse. But anyway, Hugo starts having trouble he marries. He marries a woman called Felicia Marchand from New Orleans. Basil was about 35 years old later in life, and Felicia was 39. Felicia, by the way, her father was a wig maker in New Orleans. She had a brother named Eugene. Eugene married a woman whose brother was a pirate. His name was Renato Balucci. He was one of the right-hand men and lieutenants for our famous pirate, John Lafitte. He became famous in South America with Boulevard. He became an admiral there and so forth. So anyway, Felicia Marchand had some interest in the family before she married Hugo. But they started to have trouble. Getting back to William Collins, Basil dies in 1815. We'll get why he dies. But I believe that he was keeping a lighthouse system for William Collins. Well, Basil dies. William Collins still running back. He doesn't put up his lighthouse for William Collins to see. In December of 1816, there's a storm, and William Collins comes in, but he couldn't get into the lighthouse, into the Madisonville Harbor. He crashes on the shore and is killed. He drowns. So, but anyway, before that, Basil was having trouble with his wife. They had, like I said, she was older when she got married, and he was about 35, she was about 39. They had a little girl. The little girl died. They had a few slaves, but always wondered how they made a living on that mouth of that river. They couldn't grow crops, it was sand. There was one mention of a record that one of their slaves was helped building boats. But anyway, around 1813, Basil starts borrowing money. He borrows $350 from John Baptiste Baham. He puts up his land as collateral. His mother dies in 1811. He becomes owner of the land on both sides of the river. The mother did get another piece of the river in another 600 acres up the river from the Spanish intendant Morales. So she had other property on the east bank. But anyway, she dies in 1811. And Hugo and Basil becomes the owners of it. But I always wondered how he made a living. Him and his wife started to have trouble. Basil starts borrowing money. He borrowed $350 from John Baptiste, another $350 from a relative in Pascagoula, and then he borrows $1,000 from a man named Thomas Durnford, this is a very important part of the lighthouse, because we're going to find out that the Krebs lost the land by this. Anyway, Basil writes one place that his wife is driving him nuts. She's tormenting him. And he writes this in 1814. But he dies, they don't say how he dies, in 1815. There's a slight indication it could have been suicide. But anyway, she becomes the owners now of the land on both sides of the river, at the mouth of the river. But the people who he borrowed money from want their money back, and he didn't pay it back. So she's left with this problem of it. So they start court cases, and she claims, it goes to court, she claims that she paid it, that it wasn't signed, it was illegal, blah, 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 illegal, and things like that. The cases continue, they drag on in the court. She did sell some of the property, and she did pay off the $350 and so forth. Enters Thomas Durnford. Who was Thomas? He plays a very, very important part of, and a problem of developing the lighthouse. Thomas Durnford, where did he get the name from? And who was he? He was a mixed race one, a mulatto. And his father was Elias Durnford, the surveyor general from British West Florida. We're getting into now, oh, by the way, Rusty Barnes sent me a lot of pictures, and to prove that they were living, he didn't realize this, they were living at the mouth of the river. He sent me this picture, and he wrote this letter stating that he didn't know that DonSharp kept saying that there was a house at the mouth of the river. It was Krebs. And he said that to prove it, he found in one of his pictures a two-story house. This was taken in the 20s from the other side of the river. So, but anyway, so there was a settlement at the mouth of the river by the Krebs. Basil dies. He leaves his wife, Felicia Marsan, in debt. The court cases are started, involved. She pays off the 350 several, but this big one of $1,000 owed to a Thomas Durnford was a problem, a big problem. Okay, who was this Thomas Durnford? This is a key part in the history of the defunct Lighthouse. So anyway, I'm 93 years old. You have to forgive me. Every now and then you forget. Elijah Durnford was the first Surveyor General of British West Florida. He came, and right after the government, the military came over and took over, he was appointed the surveyor. He picks out a big piece of land on Mobile Bay, 5,000 acres on the east side, the west side, the higher the hills. It was a lot healthier than low Mobile and swamps. And he was single. The land grant that he got, he started Stafford with slaves. England was a big slave bringer over to the colonies, everything. Bristol, England, by the way, under James Rumsey's father and everything, they had these ships that would go to Africa, bring them to Jamaica and so forth. So anyway, he started collecting slaves. One of his women slaves, he was young, in his 20s. He has a child by him called, and he named him Thomas Durnford. And for about 3 or 4 years, little boy, he was on the plantation. Eliza Elias goes back to England. He was he became lieutenant governor for a short time. He goes back to England to make a report, and he gets married. And he comes back, and he starts having a family. But this is the white family on that. When you try to find out about Thomas Durnford, the articles are distorted. They said that he was a cousin of Elias Durnford, the surveyor, and he was from England, and he was part of the family, and that he came over in 1762 as to help. All that is distorted. It's fake. England didn't even come over here until 1763. It was the military, so you know it was fake. So it is my opinion that Thomas Durnford was the illegitimate son with with a slave, and he took interest in his father and land and everything. England was defeated. They lost British West Florida. The Spanish said, we'll give you 3 months to sell your land and 18 months to get out. Elias Durnford, who, by the way, was the commander of Mobile that was lost to Governor Galvez. But anyway, Peter Chester, the governor, and Elias Durnford said they couldn't sell it. Nobody wants to buy the land. So anyway, and the slaves. So Elias Durnford goes to surveyor, and the other military are transferred to Havana, to New York, and back to England. They could not take the slaves with them, and they couldn't then take the property with them. They just left it there. So here is this mixed race, illegitimate child named Thomas who grew up, and he was free. He was under the Spanish. He goes to New Orleans. He was interested in land. He got that from his father, Elias. He meets a person called John McDonough in New Orleans, who was also got interested in land. He was a grain dealer for a dealer from Baltimore who got interested in the steam engine for sawmills, and he could see the so John McDonough and Thomas Durnford became friends, even though Thomas Durnford was illegitimate son of Durnford, of Elias Durnford. And he starts investing in land, and he borrows money too. He borrowed money from John McDonough too. Anyway, he loans Hugo Krebs $1,000. It starts going. Thomas Durnford, by the way, it goes. The courts rule that she's got to pay the money. So, and they said that and if they didn't have to sell the slaves and the plantation, Felicia Marchand lost the land in 1822 to Thomas Durnford. Thomas Durnford still owes money to John McDonough and so forth, but he now owns all the land, and they start selling it for him to get his money back. But he had the piece on the east side, that 31 acres that Hugo got. But he dies in 1826. Thomas died. He had children by another black woman, but under Louisiana law, you were not legally married, and you couldn't be heirs, so there was no heirs. He has Andrew. Andrew, friends with John McDonough, borrows money, became a big plantation owner. Now we're going back to Stephen Pleasanton. He's in Washington, 5th auditor. He's developing new lighthouses all over the place. He contacts the custom agent in New Orleans and says, we need lighthouses on Lake Pontchartrain in the North Shore. So Pleasanton goes to Congress and gets $5,000 to start 2 plantations, 2 lighthouses, past Manchac and the Tchefuncte. So now the custom agent goes to the records office and says, who's the owner of, this is in 1834, who's the owner of this land that's at the mouth, on the west side of the mouth of the river? Is it Durnford, Thomas, or Andrew, or something? They said, no, there's no heirs. It can't be sold because we don't have the owner. So this is what the historians are doing now. They said there was a problem with the ownership of the land, so the money went back. President had to send the money back to the Treasury Department. And for 3 years, it couldn't be built. But then I said, that was one of the biggest problems. I said, how, and I got it in here, how are you going to sell that land and build a lighthouse? Because for 3 years it couldn't be sold. And then I go into the U.S. Coast Guard records, and I got it in here, and it says at the top, executive order. And the Coast Guard said, building the lighthouse in the Tchefuncte River, it was started in 1847, and the land was purchased by executive order. 2.5. So it was the President of the United States at that time has the power by executive order to override the courts or to sell the land. So this is what it does. So this is how the Tchefuncte River Lighthouse got built, by executive order. That after it was built, there's a man by the name of Gott who got a contract to build 3 of the lighthouses on Lake Pontchartrain. The one that is on Pontchartrain Beach, and other. Pleasanton was not going to Congress and doing one at a time. He would do 2 or 3. Anyway, that's how it was started. So the lighthouse was built, and they started with the first lighthouse keeper. Now, getting back to Pleasanton, and what was in the lighthouses? They had lenses that were parabolic, they call them, and stuff like that, with the lanterns. But they were only from 17 to 20% efficient. Now we come to a guy, what happens in France, a man by the name of Fruzel. We're talking about the lamp now, and this is the lamp they were using, a small one. So the Tchefuncte River Lighthouse was not a large lighthouse. Then, going back to Washington, D.C. and the departments, Stephen Pleasanton was very frugal. He was tight. And even though he was building these lighthouses, he was watching how much they would cost, everything. In France, this guy, Augustin Fresnel, developed a new system of lighting system. It's called the Fresnel lamps. But they were very, very expensive. But instead of only putting out 17% of the light, they were so extraordinary by prisms. And he was a scientist that could put the prism and kept magnifying it, that it was 85% stronger, and it would go out miles. But as you can see the picture of there, they were very delicate, and then to build, they're very expensive. Pleasanton didn't want to buy them. He was very frugal, but he started to get the air of merchants and sea captains, because ours was so inefficient, and Congress after a while didn't take to Pleasanton's recommend about using other lenses, and they started buying them. At that time, in 1852, Pleasanton retired, and a board started, a lighthouse board started. And I got a picture of them, the lighthouse board and everything, and they drew up rules of what the lighthouse keepers should do, how to keep it. You know, it was very interesting. The Fresnel lamps became important in the latter part of the 1800s. Now I told you about the lighthouse board being founded, and they're the ones that took over after Pendleton retired and died. Here comes the Civil War. The lighthouse system for the Gulf Coast was very important, more important than the Atlantic Coast. Why? Because 2/3 of the country was agriculture on the side, and they would need ships to get in and out to get the cotton and the corn and everything. So what happened was, I got a section on the lighthouse during the Civil War. And what happened, the lighthouses became very important. because they were used by the Union Navy. Took over the Gulf Coast, and they took over the lighthouses. The Confederacy right away formed the Lighthouse Bureau too, and they started to, the important ones, to take away the equipment from the lighthouse and store them. The picture of the tallest lighthouse that was destroyed during the Civil War. But it was destroyed. These are the ones at Lake Pontchartrain. 2 distinguished lighthouses. What was the tallest lighthouse ever built in the systems, and what was the most expensive on the Gulf Coast? The tallest lighthouse was the lighthouse at Mobile Bay. They were still having trouble all along. It was called Sand Island Lighthouse, 200 feet tall. The man who built it in 1858, he became part of the Lighthouse Board. And then, what was the most expensive in Louisiana? Frank Island's Lighthouse. Jefferson, when he took over, he had a dream of making a lighthouse at the mouth of the river. It was called Frank's Island Lighthouse. It was the most expensive because they spent $85,000 building it. But the mouth of the river has no solid land. And it no sooner started they build it, it started to sink. So we have the lighthouse, the tallest lighthouse in Mobile, okay, and also the most expensive. We had on the Tchefuncte River lighthouse between 1847 and 1939, 19 lighthouse keepers. The first one is Benjamin Thurston. He planted an oak tree there that is still today is on there. But one of them that was very, Frederick Snyder, was very important. He came in 1920 from Biloxi. His father-in-law was named Rupp, and he was doing a fence in Ocean Springs. Fence line, it was digging there, and he came upon a stone that Iberville planted in 1699. He was transferred to the Tchefuncte River Lighthouse. He took the stone with him, and for 15 years he had the stone in his house at the lighthouse. When he retired, his father-in-law, Rupp, was the one living on Ocean Springs who found it, gave it to him. So when Snyder retired, Frederick Snyder retired in 1935-39, he called the Louisiana State Museum, and it's in there, and he donated to that.